Dr. Margaret Thompson's weathered hands trembled against the lioness's swollen belly, her stethoscope slipping in the African heat. The massive creature's labored breathing had stopped. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not here, not like this. Not when 3 unborn cubs were fighting for their first breath inside their dying mother. Frank Williams dropped his makeshift surgical tools, the metallic clang echoing across the Masai Mara as other volunteers stumbled backward in horror. The camp's generator hummed ominously in the sudden silence. Maggie pressed her ear closer to Django's chest, remembering her husband's final moments in that sterile Ohio hospital room where she'd been powerless to save him. Now, 8,000 miles from everything familiar, death was reaching for another soul under her watch. "Get the emergency kit, now!" she barked, her voice cracking with desperation. How had a 68-year-old retired pediatrician ended up performing life-or-death surgery on a wild lioness? And why did saving this African mother feel like her last chance at redemption? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Dr. Margaret Thompson had stood in her empty Columbus kitchen, staring at the acceptance letter from Hope Haven Senior Volunteer Program. The house felt like a mausoleum since Robert's death, every corner echoing with conversations they'd never have again. At 68, she'd delivered over 3,000 babies in her 47-year career, but she couldn't save her own husband from COVID's merciless grip. "Mom, this is insane," her daughter Sarah had said during their last phone call, her voice sharp with frustration. "You're throwing away your retirement savings to play doctor in Africa. Dad wouldn't want this." The words had cut deep, especially the unspoken accusation that Maggie was running away from grief instead of facing it. But Maggie knew something Sarah didn't understand yet. Sometimes you have to travel 8,000 miles to find your way home. Frank Williams had his own demons driving him toward Kenya's red dust and endless skies. At 72, the former auto mechanic from Detroit carried the weight of 2 wars, Vietnam in his youth, and the private battle against PTSD that had cost him his marriage after their son Michael died in Iraq. He'd spent 3 years drowning his survivor's guilt in whiskey bottles until the morning he woke up talking to Michael's photograph, promising to fix something good for once. The Hope Haven program attracted broken souls seeking purpose. 12 American seniors had gathered at the volunteer camp in Masai Mara, each carrying invisible wounds that modern medicine couldn't heal. Some came to build schools, others to maintain solar panels for remote villages. Maggie had signed up for the mobile veterinary clinic, thinking she'd treat cattle and goats, familiar territory for someone who'd spent decades caring for small, vulnerable lives. Then came their 3rd day, when Colonel James Mitchell arrived with his expensive camera equipment and credentials from National Geographic. And at 65, the former Special Forces commander projected authority that made even the camp director defer to his judgment. His silver hair and weathered face spoke of countless missions in dangerous places, while his eyes held shadows that other veterans recognized immediately. "I'm here documenting conservation efforts," Mitchell had explained, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to command. Big game photography for awareness campaigns. He'd shown them stunning images of lions, elephants, and rhinoceros, portfolio pieces that had earned him magazine covers and gallery exhibitions. What none of them knew was that Mitchell's war hadn't ended with his retirement. He'd lost his wife and twin daughters in the Pentagon attack on September 11th, and 23 years later he still woke up screaming their names. The world had taken everything he loved, so he'd decided to take what he wanted from the world. His camera equipment hid tranquilizer guns and GPS tracking devices. His conservation mission was actually a sophisticated poaching operation, targeting big cats for the black market, where live cubs could fetch $50,000 each. In the vast African wilderness, three damaged souls were about to discover that healing sometimes requires risking everything you have left. The first time Maggie saw Django, the lioness was drinking from the camp's water collection tank at dawn, her golden coat gleaming in the early light. Most wild animals fled at the first hint of human presence, but this magnificent creature simply raised her head, studied Maggie with intelligent amber eyes, then continued drinking with an almost regal composure. "That's not normal behavior," whispered Samuel Kiprotich, their Maasai guide, as he joined Maggie at the observation window. His weathered face creased with recognition and something deeper, grief perhaps, or guilt. "She knows humans. My family raised her from a cub 5 years ago." The story emerged slowly, told in the careful English that Samuel used when speaking of painful memories. Django's mother had been killed by farmers protecting their livestock, leaving behind a tiny mewling cub barely old enough to survive. Samuel's family had taken her in, bottle-feeding her through the nights, teaching her to hunt in their compound, loving her as if she were their own child. "But lions grow big," Samuel explained, his voice heavy with the weight of impossible choices. "Government said we must release her or face prison. She cried for 3 days when we took her to the reserve, broke our hearts. But what could we do?" Maggie understood that heartbreak intimately. She'd spent her career making impossible decisions: which patient to prioritize when resources were limited, when to recommend aggressive treatment versus palliative care, how to tell parents their child wouldn't make it home. The parallel wasn't lost on her as she watched Django move with the fluid grace of a wild predator who still remembered the gentle hands that had once fed her. Over the following weeks, Django became a regular visitor to the camp perimeter. She never approached aggressively, never showed the territorial behavior typical of wild lions. Instead, she seemed to study the volunteers with the curiosity of someone trying to reconnect with half-forgotten memories. Frank, practical as always, had built a simple shade structure near the watering hole using salvaged materials and his mechanical ingenuity. "If she's going to hang around, might as well make her comfortable," he'd grumbled, though Maggie caught him talking to Django in the same gentle tone he might have used with his son decades ago. The other volunteers remained divided. Dr. Patricia Hammond, a retired university professor from Boston, argued vehemently against any interaction. "We're not here to play Snow White with dangerous predators," she'd declared during one heated camp meeting. "That animal could kill any one of us without warning." But Maggie had spent her career reading subtle signs of distress and need, and everything about Django's behavior suggested an animal seeking help rather than hunting prey. The lioness moved more slowly than she should, resting frequently in positions that suggested discomfort. Her flanks had begun to swell with the unmistakable signs of pregnancy. "Something's not right," Maggie confided to Frank one evening as they watched Django settle under his makeshift shelter. "She's carrying cubs, but her breathing is labored. In human pregnancies, I'd be concerned about complications." Frank nodded, his mechanic's eye trained to spot problems others might miss. "She's favoring her left side, and look at how her back legs are positioned. That's not normal for a healthy animal." Colonel Mitchell had joined their observations with professional interest, his expensive cameras capturing every detail of Django's behavior. "Fascinating specimen," he'd commented, adjusting his telephoto lens. "Pregnant females are incredibly protective. If she's seeking human contact, the pregnancy might be causing more distress than usual." His expertise seemed invaluable. Mitchell knew animal behavior patterns, understood the physiology of big cats, and had connections with veterinary specialists across East Africa. When Maggie expressed concern about Django's condition, he immediately offered to arrange satellite consultations with wildlife veterinarians. "Time is critical with pregnancy complications," Mitchell had explained, his military bearing lending authority to his words. "If we're going to help her, we need to act decisively." Half measures could cost both mother and cubs their lives. The satellite consultation confirmed Maggie's fears. Dr. Elizabeth Mwangi, a veterinarian in Nairobi, studied the photographs Mitchell had taken and delivered a sobering assessment. Multiple births, probably triplets based on the size and shape of her abdomen. The positioning suggests at least one breech presentation. Without intervention, natural delivery will be extremely difficult, possibly fatal. That night, as Maggie lay in her narrow camp bed listening to the sounds of the African night, she felt the familiar weight of medical responsibility settling on her shoulders. Django wasn't just another patient. She was a bridge between worlds, a creature who'd known human love and lost it, now carrying new life that hung in the balance. Frank found her at dawn, sitting by the water tank where Django usually appeared. "Penny for your thoughts, Doc? I keep thinking about the last thing I said to Robert," Maggie admitted. "I'll see you tomorrow." Such ordinary words. But they were the last ones he ever heard from me. What if Django's cubs never get to hear their mother's voice because we were too afraid to try? The morning that changed everything began with Django collapsing near the water tank. Maggie had been preparing for her usual dawn observation when she heard the distinctive sound of labored breathing echoing across the camp. She found the lioness lying on her side, flanks heaving with the unmistakable rhythm of early labor contractions. "Frank!" Maggie's voice cut through the morning air with surgical precision. "Bring the emergency medical kit, now!" Within minutes, the camp buzzed with anxious activity. Django's condition had deteriorated rapidly overnight, her breathing shallow and her amber eyes clouded with pain. Maggie knelt beside the massive creature, her medical training overriding decades of instinctive fear. When she placed her stethoscope against Django's swollen belly, the racing heartbeats she detected told a story that made her blood run cold. 3 distinct heartbeats, she whispered to Frank, who had arrived with the medical supplies, "but they're irregular." "The cubs are in distress." Colonel Mitchell appeared with his equipment, immediately taking charge of the situation with military efficiency. "I've contacted Dr. Mwangi in Nairobi via satellite phone," he announced, his authoritative voice cutting through the worried murmurs of other volunteers. "She's standing by for a video consultation, but we need to establish whether this is a medical emergency requiring immediate intervention." The video call confirmed their worst fears. Dr. Mwangi's image flickered on Mitchell's satellite communication device as she studied the live footage of Django's condition. Her professional composure couldn't hide the concern in her voice. "Preeclampsia equivalent in big cats," she diagnosed grimly. "The cubs are too large for natural delivery, and at least one is in breech position. Without cesarean intervention within the next few hours, we'll lose both mother and cubs." The camp director, David Chen, a retired school administrator from California, paced nervously behind the gathered volunteers. "Dr. Thompson, you can't be seriously considering performing surgery on a wild lioness. The liability alone could shut down our entire program." But Maggie was already calculating logistics with the focused intensity that had made her one of Columbus's most respected pediatricians. "Frank, I need you to sterilize every piece of equipment we have. Boiling water, alcohol, whatever antiseptic supplies we can find. If we're going to do this, we do it right." "Maggie, listen to yourself," Dr. Patricia Hammond interrupted, her academic voice sharp with disbelief. "You're talking about performing major surgery on a 400-pound predator with no anesthesia, no proper surgical tools, no backup if something goes wrong." This isn't some romantic movie. This is real life with real consequences. The argument that followed would be remembered by every volunteer present. Patricia's concerns were entirely valid. They had no veterinary surgical experience, no proper anesthesia equipment, and no way to control a conscious lioness during a cesarean procedure. The legal implications alone could destroy not just the Hope Haven program, but their personal lives as well. "I've been fixing broken things my whole life," Frank said quietly, his weathered hands steady as he began organizing their makeshift medical supplies. Engines, machines, sometimes people. "This lioness isn't broken. She just needs help delivering her babies. Doc Thompson has delivered more babies than anyone in this camp has delivered anything." Mitchell supported the intervention with compelling arguments about documentation and scientific value. "This could be groundbreaking research," he insisted, his cameras already recording every moment. "An interspecies medical intervention in the wild performed by civilian volunteers, the conservation implications alone justify the risk." But it was Django herself who settled the debate. As the volunteers argued, the lioness struggled to her feet and approached Maggie directly. With movements that defied her obvious pain, she lowered her massive head and gently pressed it against Maggie's shoulder, a gesture of trust so profound that it silenced every objection. "She's asking for help," Maggie whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of recognition. "I've seen that look in the eyes of every mother I've ever treated. Fear, hope, desperation. It's the same whether you have 2 legs or 4. The decision crystallized with brutal clarity. Maggie had spent 2 years drowning in guilt over her inability to save Robert, tormented by the medical knowledge that came too late to help the person who mattered most. Here was a chance to use that knowledge to transform decades of expertise into action that could save lives. "We proceed," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had made life and death decisions throughout her career. Frank assists. Mitchell documents everything for Dr. Mwangi's guidance. Everyone else maintains a safe perimeter. As they began preparations for what amounted to battlefield surgery, none of them noticed the subtle changes in Mitchell's behavior. His documentation had become more systematic, his questions more focused on the cub's value than their medical condition. The sophisticated communication equipment he'd brought supposedly for wildlife photography was actually coordinating with teams positioned throughout the reserve. Frank's military instincts, dulled by grief and alcohol for too many years, began to sharpen as he observed Mitchell's movements. Something about the colonel's positioning, his constant radio communications, his insistence on proper documentation, triggered warnings that Frank hadn't felt since his tours in Vietnam and Iraq. "Doc," Frank murmured as they sterilized instruments in boiling water, "something doesn't feel right about our photographer friend. Just keep your eyes open, okay?" The surgery was about to begin, but Frank couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far more dangerous than emergency veterinary care. The bond between Maggie and Django deepened with each passing day as the lioness's condition became increasingly precarious. What had begun as professional concern evolved into something more profound, a connection that transcended species boundaries and touched the maternal instincts that had driven Maggie's entire medical career. Every morning, Django would position herself near the medical station Frank had constructed from salvaged materials and camp supplies. The makeshift shelter provided shade and privacy, but more importantly, it had become a sanctuary where trust could flourish. Maggie found herself spending hours observing the lioness's breathing patterns, monitoring her vital signs through careful observation, and documenting symptoms that would have sent any human patient straight to the emergency room. "She's not eating enough," Maggie confided to Frank during one of their evening discussions. In human pregnancies, loss of appetite combined with her other symptoms would indicate severe complications. "We're looking at a medical emergency that's getting worse by the hour." Frank had become Maggie's unofficial partner in what the other volunteers had begun calling the Lioness Project. His mechanical skills had proven invaluable in creating medical equipment from available resources, a blood pressure monitoring system adapted from camping gear, scales improvised from maintenance supplies, and surgical tools sterilized with equipment designed for camp hygiene. The other volunteers remained divided about their intervention. Dr. Patricia Hammond led the opposition with academic arguments about professional boundaries and legal liability. "We're retired teachers and mechanics, not wildlife veterinarians," she insisted during increasingly heated camp meetings. "What happens when that lioness decides we're threats instead of helpers? What happens when Kenyan authorities discover we're performing unlicensed medical procedures on protected wildlife?" But Samuel Kiprotich, their Maasai guide, provided cultural context that complicated the ethical debate. "In our tradition, when an animal seeks help from humans, it is a sacred trust," he explained, his weathered hands gesturing toward the acacia trees where Django often rested. "My family cared for her when she was helpless. Now she returns to us in her time of need. To refuse would dishonor the bond that was created." Colonel Mitchell positioned himself as the voice of scientific reason, advocating for intervention while maintaining detailed documentation of every development. His professional cameras captured Django's behavioral changes with clinical precision, and his satellite communications provided ongoing consultation with Dr. Mwangi in Nairobi. What impressed the volunteers most was Mitchell's apparent expertise in animal psychology and veterinary procedures. "Multiple births in big cats carry exceptional risk," Mitchell explained during one of their planning sessions, his military bearing lending authority to his words. "But with proper preparation and professional guidance, we can provide the support she needs. The scientific value alone justifies the effort." Interspecies medical cooperation documented in real time could revolutionize our understanding of human-animal relationships. However, Frank's military instincts continued to trigger warning signals that he couldn't quite articulate. Mitchell's behavior patterns felt familiar: the constant radio communications, the systematic documentation, the way he positioned himself to observe rather than participate directly in the medical care. It reminded Frank of reconnaissance missions where intelligence gathering took priority over the stated objectives. "Something's not adding up," Frank confided to Maggie during a quiet moment when Mitchell was away from camp. "That guy's got more communication equipment than our entire camp combined." "And did you notice how he always has an excuse to be somewhere else when we're actually hands-on with Django? He documents everything but never gets his hands dirty." Maggie had been too focused on Django's medical needs to pay attention to such details, but Frank's concerns resonated with her own intuitive unease. Mitchell's help had been invaluable, but his emotional detachment seemed incongruent with someone genuinely committed to conservation. Most troubling was his persistent focus on the cubs' development and their potential viability outside the womb. The breaking point came when Django's labor began prematurely during a violent thunderstorm that isolated the camp from outside communication. The lioness had sought shelter under Frank's makeshift medical station, her contractions visible and clearly distressing. Maggie's examination revealed that the first cub was positioned correctly, but labor was progressing too rapidly for the mother's weakened condition. "We need to be ready for emergency intervention," Maggie announced, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Frank, prepare the surgical equipment. If the cubs become trapped, or if Django's bleeding becomes uncontrolled, we'll need to move fast." Mitchell's reaction was immediate and intense. Rather than offering support or consultation with Dr. Mwangi, he began making urgent radio calls despite the storm interference. His conversations were conducted in coded language that Frank recognized from his military experience, tactical communications designed to coordinate field operations. "Unit 2, target is entering active phase," Mitchell spoke into his satellite device, his voice carrying the clipped efficiency of someone coordinating a mission rather than documenting a birth. "Confirm your position for asset recovery. Weather window closing in 60 minutes. Frank's suspicions crystallized into horrifying certainty. Mitchell wasn't documenting conservation efforts. He was coordinating a capture operation. The timing of Django's labor provided the perfect opportunity to secure cubs at their most vulnerable moment, when the mother would be incapacitated and unable to defend her offspring. "Maggie," Frank whispered urgently, positioning himself between her and Mitchell, "we need to talk. Right now." But events were moving too quickly for lengthy explanations. Django's first cub was born during the height of the storm, a tiny, wet creature that immediately began the distinctive crying that signals successful lung development. The lioness responded with maternal instincts that transcended her own pain, licking her newborn clean while preparing for the delivery of its siblings. The second cub's birth proved more complicated. Positioned incorrectly in the birth canal, it required careful manipulation that tested the limits of Maggie's human obstetrics experience applied to feline anatomy. With Frank assisting and rain pounding on their makeshift shelter, they worked together to guide the cubs safely into the world. Mitchell's behavior became increasingly agitated as the births progressed. His radio communications intensified, and he began positioning camera equipment that seemed more focused on security surveillance than medical documentation. When Frank confronted him directly about the nature of his calls, Mitchell's military training became evident in his evasive responses and tactical awareness. "You're documenting a birth or planning a kidnapping?" Frank demanded, his Vietnam-era combat instincts fully activated. "Because that sure sounds like tactical coordination to me." The confrontation was interrupted by complications with the third cub. Unlike its siblings, this one appeared to be in serious distress, its birth canal positioning creating a life-threatening situation for both cub and mother. Maggie found herself facing the kind of split-second decision that had defined her medical career: risky intervention that might save lives, or cautious observation that might result in multiple deaths. "I need to perform an emergency procedure," she announced, her hands already moving with the muscle memory of decades spent in delivery rooms. "Frank, hold her steady. This cub is trapped, and if we don't act now, we'll lose both mother and baby." As Maggie began what amounted to field surgery on a conscious lioness, using improvised tools during a thunderstorm, Mitchell made his final radio transmission of the evening. "All units, prepare for immediate extraction. Assets will be most vulnerable during the next 30 minutes. Move to positions and await my signal." Frank heard enough of the transmission to understand that their medical emergency had become something far more sinister. Somewhere in the storm-darkened reserve, armed teams were moving into position to steal newborn cubs from their mother while she was recovering from a traumatic birth. The moment that should have been a celebration of new life was about to become a confrontation between those who sought to protect it and those who saw it as nothing more than valuable merchandise. Maggie remained focused on her patient, unaware that the man she'd trusted to document their humanitarian efforts was actually orchestrating their betrayal. Thunder crashed overhead as Frank made his decision. Whatever Mitchell's real agenda, it ended now. The third cub's delivery became a nightmare of medical complexity and mounting danger as Maggie worked with trembling hands to save both mother and baby. The tiny creature was trapped in a breech position, its umbilical cord wrapped dangerously around its neck, cutting off vital oxygen flow. Every second of delay increased the risk of brain damage or death, while Django's weakening condition made aggressive intervention increasingly perilous. "I can't get the right angle," Maggie whispered, sweat mixing with rainwater as she worked under the inadequate lighting of Frank's improvised medical station. "The cord is too tight, and if I pull too hard, I could cause a hemorrhage that kills them both." Frank positioned himself to provide better illumination with their emergency lanterns, his mechanical precision invaluable in creating the stable workspace that Maggie needed for delicate manipulation. but his attention was divided between assisting the medical emergency and monitoring Mitchell's increasingly suspicious behavior. The colonel had moved to the perimeter of their makeshift operating area, his radio communications becoming more frequent and urgent. "Unit 3, confirm your approach vector," Mitchell spoke into his satellite device, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone coordinating a tactical operation. "Weather window is narrowing. We have maybe 20 minutes before visibility improves and local authorities can respond." The pieces fell into place with horrifying clarity as Frank recognized the military terminology and coordination patterns. Mitchell wasn't documenting a wildlife birth. He was orchestrating a kidnapping operation timed to coincide with the cub's most vulnerable moments. The sophisticated communication equipment, the tactical positioning, the constant focus on the cub's development and viability, everything pointed to a carefully planned capture operation. "Maggie, we've got a problem," Frank said quietly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "Our photographer friend isn't what he claims to be. Those radio calls aren't going to National Geographic." But Maggie was completely absorbed in the life and death struggle to free the trapped cub. Using techniques adapted from her decades of human obstetrics, she carefully maneuvered her hands to create space for the umbilical cord while supporting the cub's delicate neck vertebrae. The procedure required absolute concentration and steady hands. Any mistake could result in permanent paralysis or immediate death. Django's maternal instincts remained strong despite her exhaustion and pain. The lioness seemed to understand that Maggie was trying to help, allowing the human touch that would normally trigger violent defensive reactions. Her amber eyes, clouded with pain but alert with intelligence, tracked Maggie's movements with the trust of a patient who recognized skilled medical care. The breakthrough came when Maggie managed to create enough space to loop the umbilical cord over the cub's head, instantly restoring blood flow and allowing the tiny creature to complete its journey into the world. The cub's first breath was weak but audible, its small cry joining those of its siblings in the chaotic symphony of new life. "She did it," Frank breathed, his voice filled with admiration and relief. 3 cubs, all breathing, all moving. "Doc, you just performed a miracle." But their celebration was shattered by the sound of vehicles approaching through the storm. Mitchell's radio crackled with final coordinates as headlights pierced the darkness, revealing a convoy of heavily modified trucks equipped with specialized animal transport equipment. The timing was no coincidence. Mitchell had coordinated the arrival to coincide with the cub's birth, when they would be most valuable to black market dealers. "Step away from the animals, Doctor," Mitchell commanded, his voice transformed from helpful collaborator to military authority. In his hands was a tranquilizer rifle, its barrel aimed directly at Frank's chest. "This operation is now under my control." The betrayal hit Maggie like a physical blow. The man she'd trusted to document their humanitarian efforts, the expert who'd provided crucial medical guidance, the conservation photographer whose credentials had seemed impeccable. All of it had been an elaborate deception designed to gain access to Django and her cubs. "You son of a bitch," Frank growled, his Vietnam-era combat instincts fully activated as he assessed tactical options. "We just saved their lives, and you want to kidnap them for some rich collector's private zoo?" Mitchell's laugh was bitter and devoid of humor. "Private zoo? You think too small, mechanic? These cubs are worth $50,000 each on the international market. Healthy lion cubs with documented medical intervention during birth. The exotic pet trade will pay premium prices for that kind of pedigree." The approaching vehicles disgorged a team of armed men equipped with specialized capture equipment, net guns, portable cages, and veterinary supplies designed for animal transport. Their movements were coordinated and professional, suggesting extensive experience in wildlife trafficking operations. Mitchell had clearly planned this operation for months, using the Hope Haven volunteer program as cover for reconnaissance and preparation. The beauty of using retired Americans as cover, Mitchell continued, his tranquilizer rifle never wavering from Frank's position, is that nobody suspects humanitarian volunteers of facilitating wildlife crime. Your medical intervention just increased these cubs' value exponentially, proof of successful human intervention and veterinary care. Django sensed the danger even in her weakened post-birth condition. The lioness struggled to position herself between her newborn cubs and the approaching men, her maternal instincts overriding exhaustion and pain. Her low growling warned of explosive violence if anyone approached her offspring, despite her obvious vulnerability. Maggie found herself caught between medical responsibility and moral outrage. Her patient needed continued care, monitoring for post-birth complications, ensuring the cubs were nursing properly, checking for signs of infection or hemorrhaging. But the men surrounding them were planning to tear apart the family she'd just helped bring safely into the world. "These cubs need their mother," Maggie said, her voice carrying the authority of decades spent advocating for patients. "Separation now could kill them. They're too young for bottle feeding, too vulnerable for transport. You're talking about murdering babies for money." Mitchell's response revealed the psychological damage that had transformed a decorated military officer into a wildlife criminal. "The world took my family from me, Doctor. My wife and daughters died because some terrorist decided their lives didn't matter. Now I take what I want from the world, and what I want is enough money to make the pain stop." The revelation of Mitchell's motivation, grief transformed into greed, loss twisted into cruelty, struck Maggie with recognition. She'd seen the same pattern in her own response to Robert's death, the same temptation to let pain justify destructive choices. The difference was that she'd chosen to heal rather than harm, to create life rather than destroy it. Frank's military training provided tactical assessment of their situation. 6 armed men, superior firepower, coordinated positions that eliminated most escape routes. But they also had advantages: familiarity with the terrain, knowledge of camp layout, and most importantly, the moral clarity that came from protecting innocent lives. "You know what the difference is between you and me, Colonel?" Frank said, his voice steady despite the tranquilizer rifle aimed at his chest. "I lost my son to war, and it made me want to protect other people's children. You lost your family to violence, and it made you want to create more violence. That says everything about who we really are." The storm was beginning to subside, but the real tempest was just beginning. As Mitchell's team moved into position to capture the cubs, Django's protective instincts triggered the kind of maternal fury that had made lions legendary predators. Despite her weakened condition, she rose to defend her offspring with the same ferocity that had allowed her species to survive for millennia. The standoff that followed would determine whether new life would be protected or exploited, whether healing would triumph over greed, whether the bonds of trust built over weeks of careful care would survive the ultimate test of human character. Thunder crashed overhead, as if nature itself was protesting the violation about to unfold, while 3 tiny cubs continued their first hours of life, oblivious to the battle being fought for their future. The first tranquilizer dart hit Frank in the shoulder before he could react, the chemical cocktail designed to drop a full-grown man within seconds. His military training had prepared him for many scenarios, but not for betrayal by someone he'd trusted with the lives of innocent creatures. As the sedative coursed through his bloodstream, Frank's last coherent thought was a desperate prayer that Maggie would find a way to protect Django and her cubs. "Frank!" Maggie's scream pierced the night as she watched her friend collapse beside the makeshift medical station. The man who had spent weeks building trust with a wild lioness, who had crafted surgical tools from camping equipment, who had become her partner in an impossible mission of healing, now lay unconscious, while armed strangers prepared to steal the babies they had fought so hard to save. Mitchell's team moved with military precision, their specialized equipment designed specifically for capturing large predators and their offspring. Net guns, portable steel cages, and chemical restraints spoke of extensive experience in wildlife trafficking operations. These weren't opportunistic poachers, they were professionals who had turned conservation into a profitable criminal enterprise. "Step away from the lioness, Doctor," Mitchell commanded, his voice carrying the cold authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "You've done excellent work keeping the mother and cubs alive. That medical intervention just tripled their market value, proof of successful human care and veterinary support." Jengo's maternal instincts exploded into protective fury despite her weakened post-birth condition. The lioness positioned herself over her 3 newborn cubs, her low growling escalating to full-throated roars that echoed across the Masai Mara. Even exhausted from a traumatic delivery, she remained a 400-pound predator willing to die protecting her offspring. "You don't understand," Maggie pleaded, her medical training providing awful clarity about what separation would mean. "These cubs are less than an hour old. They need colostrum from their mother, antibodies that can only come from nursing. Take them now, and they'll die within days from immune system failure." Mitchell's laugh was bitter and devoid of compassion. "Doctor, these cubs are worth $50,000 each to collectors who want exotic pets with documented medical pedigrees. Dead cubs are worthless, so we'll keep them alive long enough to reach buyers. After that, their survival becomes someone else's problem." The moral horror of the situation crystallized with devastating clarity. Maggie had spent her entire career protecting vulnerable lives, delivering babies into loving families, ensuring that new life had every chance to flourish. Now she was being forced to watch as criminals prepared to tear apart a family she had helped create, turning her medical skills into accessories to kidnapping and exploitation. One of Mitchell's men approached with a specialized capture cage designed for lion cubs, mesh steel construction with veterinary monitoring equipment that spoke of significant investment in this criminal operation. The approaching footsteps triggered Jengo's final surge of maternal rage, her exhausted body finding strength that defied medical explanation. The lioness launched herself at the approaching captor with explosive violence that scattered the assault team and sent equipment flying across the medical station. Her claws raked across expensive capture gear, while her roars summoned every protective instinct that millions of years of evolution had embedded in her species. For a brief, glorious moment, it seemed that maternal fury might triumph over human greed. But the tranquilizer dart that hit Jengo's flank contained enough sedative to drop a full-grown lion within minutes. Maggie watched in horror as the magnificent creature who had trusted her with the most vulnerable moment of her life began to stumble, her protective instincts failing as chemical unconsciousness overwhelmed her nervous system. "No!" Maggie threw herself over the cubs as Jengo collapsed, her own body becoming the only barrier between newborn innocents and professional kidnappers. "These babies need their mother. Take me instead. I'm worth more alive than they are dead." The negotiation that followed revealed the depth of Mitchell's psychological damage and the carefully calculated nature of his criminal operation. He needed Maggie alive to provide ongoing veterinary care during transport, ensuring the cubs' survival until they reached buyers. But he also needed her compliant, which meant leveraging her emotional investment in the animals she had helped deliver. "Here's the deal, Doctor," Mitchell said, his tranquilizer rifle now aimed directly at the unconscious Jengo. "You provide medical support during transport, keep the cubs alive and healthy, and when we reach our buyers, you walk away with enough money to retire comfortably. Refuse, and I put another dart in the mother, a permanent one." The choice was no choice at all. Maggie could watch Django die and the cubs be taken anyway, or she could accompany them and hope for opportunities to escape or sabotage the operation. Her medical oath demanded that she protect life, even if it meant temporarily enabling criminals who threatened everything she believed in. As Mitchell's team loaded the unconscious Django and her newborn cubs into specialized transport vehicles, Maggie found herself climbing into the passenger seat of a truck that represented the complete perversion of everything she had worked to accomplish. The medical equipment she had used to save lives was now being deployed to facilitate kidnapping and exploitation. The convoy began moving through the storm-darkened reserve, their headlights cutting through rain and darkness as they transported stolen lives toward buyers who viewed magnificent predators as nothing more than expensive possessions. Frank remained unconscious in the medical station, and the other volunteers had no idea that their conservation mission had become a criminal operation. Maggie's last view of the Hope Haven camp showed emergency lights flickering through the storm, other volunteers probably assuming that Mitchell's team was conducting emergency evacuation due to Django's medical complications. The perfect cover story. Humanitarian medical intervention that nobody would question until it was far too late to mount any rescue operation. Inside the transport vehicle, 3 tiny cubs cried for their unconscious mother while Maggie struggled with the most impossible ethical dilemma of her medical career. She was now an unwilling accomplice to wildlife trafficking. Her healing hands transformed into tools for criminals who saw new life only as opportunities for profit. The road ahead disappeared into darkness, carrying stolen innocence toward an uncertain fate, while the woman who had fought to save them tried desperately to find some way to turn medical knowledge into liberation. Storm clouds gathered overhead as if nature itself was weeping for the violation of trust that had transformed salvation into enslavement. Behind them, Frank's unconscious form lay beside equipment that had been designed to preserve life, but was now being used to facilitate its destruction. The Hope Haven volunteer program's greatest success had become its most devastating failure, leaving broken trust and shattered idealism scattered across the African wilderness like debris from a moral catastrophe. The cubs' cries echoed through the night, a sound that would haunt Maggie's dreams for years to come. The voices of innocence calling for a mother who could not answer, protected by someone who had promised to heal but was now powerless to prevent their exploitation. The revelation that shattered Mitchell's psychological armor came not from confrontation or negotiation, but from the soft, desperate crying of newborn cubs calling for their unconscious mother. As the transport convoy wound through the dark Kenyan countryside, the tiny voices in the specialized cages triggered memories that Mitchell had spent 23 years trying to suppress. The sound of his own twin daughters crying in the hospital nursery, hours before the world exploded into terrorism and loss. "Stop the convoy!" Mitchell commanded suddenly, his voice cracking with an emotion that his men had never heard from their commanding officer. The vehicles pulled over on a remote stretch of highway, rain drumming against the windshields as the criminal operation came to an unexpected halt. Maggie seized the moment of uncertainty, her maternal instincts and medical training combining into fierce advocacy for her patients. "Colonel, look at them," she said, pointing to the 3 cubs whose cries were becoming increasingly distressed. "They're less than 2 hours old. They don't understand why their mother won't respond to their calls. They're dying of fear and abandonment." For the first time since the operation began, Mitchell actually really looked, at the newborn animals he was planning to sell. What he saw in their tiny, searching faces was the same helpless vulnerability he had witnessed in his daughter's final moments, the same innocent trust that the world would provide protection and love. "Sarah and Emma," he whispered, the names he hadn't spoken aloud in years, escaping his lips like a prayer. They were born 6 weeks premature. So small, so fragile. The doctors said they needed constant monitoring, special care. Jennifer never left their side, singing to them, telling them Mommy was there. The psychological dam that Mitchell had constructed around his grief began to crack as he remembered details that his survival instincts had forced him to bury. His wife Jennifer singing lullabies to their premature daughters, her hands gently stroking their tiny faces through the incubator openings. The way the babies would calm at the sound of her voice, finding peace in the presence of the mother who loved them beyond measure. The morning of September 11th, I was supposed to take family leave, Mitchell continued, his voice hollow with suppressed anguish. Jennifer wanted me home for the girls' first doctor's appointment outside the NICU, but I had one last briefing, one final meeting that couldn't wait. I told her I'd meet them at the Pentagon daycare afterward. Maggie understood the trajectory of trauma that had led Mitchell to this moment. How survivor's guilt could metastasize into something destructive, how the inability to save loved ones could transform into the compulsion to control and exploit life itself. She had felt the same darkness after Robert's death, the same temptation to blame the world for losses that felt cosmically unfair. The daycare center took a direct hit, Mitchell said, tears mixing with rain on his weathered face. Jennifer was holding both girls when the plane struck. The investigators said they died instantly, that they wouldn't have suffered. But I know they called for Daddy, just like these cubs are calling for their mother. Frank's military training had taught him to recognize the moment when enemy psychological defenses collapsed, but nothing had prepared him for witnessing the complete emotional breakdown of someone he had considered irredeemably evil. The sedatives were wearing off, allowing him to observe the transformation of a hardened criminal into a broken father, confronting 23 years of unprocessed grief. I became everything I once fought against, Mitchell admitted, his weapon lowering as the weight of recognition settled on his shoulders. I told myself that taking from the world was justice for what the world took from me. But these cubs haven't taken anything from anyone. They're just babies calling for their mommy. The moment of moral reckoning was interrupted by the approach of Kenyan Wildlife Service vehicles, their emergency lights cutting through the storm-darkened countryside. Frank's emergency beacon, activated before the tranquilizer took effect, had finally reached authorities who were now converging on Mitchell's convoy with the full force of anti-poaching enforcement. "Boss, we need to move," one of Mitchell's men urged, his voice tight with the urgency of professional criminals facing imminent capture. "KWS response teams are 3 minutes out. If we abandon the operation now, we can still reach the Tanzanian border before they establish roadblocks." But Mitchell was no longer the commanding officer who had orchestrated this criminal enterprise. The man who emerged from his psychological collapse was someone Frank recognized from his own journey through trauma and healing, a father whose love for lost children was finally stronger than his need for revenge against the world that had taken them. "Release the mother," Mitchell ordered, his voice carrying a different kind of authority now, the moral clarity of someone choosing redemption over destruction. "Dr. Thompson, how quickly can you revive the lioness safely?" The medical reversal procedure required precise timing and careful monitoring, but Maggie's experience with anesthesia protocols provided the knowledge needed to counteract the tranquilizers safely. As she worked to administer stimulants that would restore Django's consciousness, Mitchell's men faced the reality that their leader had abandoned the criminal operation they had risked their freedom to execute. "Colonel, you're talking about throwing away months of planning and hundreds of thousands in potential profits," his second-in-command protested. "These animals are merchandise, not family pets." "We complete the mission, or we all go to prison for nothing." The confrontation that followed revealed the depth of Mitchell's transformation and the courage required to choose justice over profit, healing over harm. When his own men raised weapons against him, Mitchell positioned himself between the criminal enterprise he had created and the innocent lives he now sought to protect. 23 years ago, I failed to protect my family, Mitchell declared, standing over the cages that held Django's cubs. I won't fail again. These babies are going home to their mother, and anyone who objects can explain their position to Kenyan authorities. Django's revival was a gradual process that began with reflexive muscle movements and progressed to conscious awareness of her cubs' distressed cries. The moment when mother and babies were reunited transcended species boundaries, touching something universal about parental love that even hardened criminals couldn't ignore. Frank watched the reunion with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed justice triumph over exploitation, healing overcome harm. The man who had once planned to sell these cubs for profit was now on his knees, gently placing newborns beside their mother, while tears of recognition and redemption flowed down his face. "I'm sorry," Mitchell whispered to Django as she began nursing her cubs, her maternal instincts immediately focused on their care and comfort. "I'm so sorry I almost took them from you. No mother should lose her babies. No babies should lose their mother." The Kenyan Wildlife Service officers who arrived moments later found a scene that defied their expectations. Armed poachers surrendering without resistance, stolen wildlife being voluntarily returned, and a retired American military officer confessing to crimes while ensuring the welfare of his intended victims. "Colonel James Mitchell, formerly of the United States Special Forces," he announced to the lead KWS officer, his hands raised in surrender. "I am the leader of this poaching operation, and I am voluntarily surrendering myself and my team to Kenyan authorities. These civilians," he gestured toward Maggie and Frank, "are innocent victims who were forced to participate under duress." As dawn broke over the Masai Mara, the story that began with medical emergency had transformed into something far more complex, a tale of trauma confronted, redemption chosen, and families preserved across species boundaries. Mitchell's journey from criminal mastermind to protector of the innocent reflected the same healing process that had brought Maggie and Frank to Kenya in search of purpose beyond grief. The cubs that had been destined for illegal sale were now nursing peacefully beside their mother, their cries of distress replaced by the contented sounds of newborns finding comfort in maternal love. Justice had been served not through punishment alone, but through the recognition that healing was possible even for those who had chosen harm over hope. The sunrise that illuminated their faces seemed to promise new beginnings for everyone whose lives had been touched by this unexpected confrontation between love and loss, between the courage to protect and the choice to exploit innocent life. 6 months after the night that changed everything, Dr. Margaret Thompson stood at the observation deck of the newly established Django Conservation Center, watching 3 healthy lion cubs play in the afternoon sun while their mother rested in the shade of an acacia tree. The center, built with funds from Mitchell's voluntary asset forfeiture and international conservation donations, had become a symbol of redemption and second chances that attracted visitors from around the world. "They're getting so big," Frank Williams observed, joining Maggie at the viewing platform with 2 cups of coffee and the satisfied expression of someone who had found his true calling. At 73, the former auto mechanic had transformed into the Conservation Center's head of operations, his mechanical skills invaluable in maintaining the specialized equipment that kept the facility running smoothly. The 3 cubs, named Hope, Faith, and Grace by unanimous volunteer vote, had thrived under their mother's care and the protective oversight of the conservation team. Hope, the largest of the 3, showed the bold curiosity that would serve her well as a future pride leader. Faith, smaller but more cautious, demonstrated the intelligence that made lions such successful predators. Grace, the cub who had nearly died during birth, possessed a gentle nature that seemed to understand how precious life truly was. Django herself had become something of a celebrity in conservation circles, her story of successful human-animal medical cooperation, inspiring documentaries, research papers, and funding initiatives that supported wildlife protection throughout East Africa. But for Maggie, the lioness remained simply a patient who had trusted her with the most vulnerable moment of her life, a trust that had transformed both their destinies. "Any word from Sarah?" Frank asked, referring to Maggie's daughter, who had initially opposed her mother's African adventure with such vehemence. The relationship between mother and daughter had undergone its own healing process, complicated but ultimately strengthened by Maggie's choice to risk everything for creatures that couldn't speak for themselves. "She's flying in next week with the grandchildren," Maggie replied, her voice warm with anticipation and the contentment of someone who had finally found peace with her life choices. "Emma and Jacob have been asking about the lion babies non-stop since I sent them the photos. Sarah says she's never seen them so excited about anything." The reconciliation with her daughter had been gradual and sometimes painful, requiring honest conversations about grief, purpose, and the different ways people process loss. Sarah had initially seen her mother's volunteer work as a dangerous escape from reality, but witnessing the tangible results of conservation efforts had helped her understand that healing sometimes required radical changes in perspective and geography. Frank nodded with the satisfaction of someone who understood the importance of family healing. His own journey had included difficult conversations with his ex-wife and the slow process of rebuilding relationships that trauma had damaged. The Conservation Center had become not just a place of work, but a community where people who had lost their way could find new purpose in protecting vulnerable lives. "Speaking of family," Frank said, gesturing toward the approaching figure of James Mitchell, who was returning from his daily rounds as the center's volunteer coordinator. The transformation of the former poaching leader into one of Kenya's most effective conservation advocates remained one of the most remarkable aspects of their story. Mitchell's path to redemption had been neither easy nor certain. After confessing to Kenyan authorities and providing information that led to the dismantling of several international wildlife trafficking networks, he had faced the possibility of decades in prison. But his cooperation, combined with victim impact statements from Maggie and Frank, had resulted in a sentence that emphasized rehabilitation and community service over purely punitive measures. The morning patrol found fresh elephant tracks near the northern boundary, Mitchell reported, his weathered face showing the peace that came from protecting rather than exploiting wildlife. No signs of poaching activity, just a family group moving through their traditional migration route. Rangers are maintaining observation distance to ensure safe passage. At 66, Mitchell had become an unlikely but effective advocate for wildlife protection, his intimate knowledge of criminal networks making him invaluable in preventing poaching operations. His transformation from predator to protector inspired other conservation programs to consider rehabilitation approaches for wildlife criminals who demonstrated genuine remorse and commitment to change. The irony wasn't lost on any of them that the man who had once planned to kidnap Django's cubs was now one of their most dedicated protectors. Mitchell's daily routines included monitoring the cubs' development, maintaining security protocols that prevented unauthorized access, and sharing his story with visitors who needed to understand that redemption was possible even for those who had chosen the darkest paths. "The documentary crew from National Geographic will be here tomorrow," Mitchell continued, his voice carrying the professional competence that had never left him, merely redirected toward constructive purposes. "They want to interview all of us about the night everything changed. I've prepared talking points about rehabilitation programs for wildlife criminals." The media attention had been both blessing and challenge for the Conservation Center. While the publicity brought crucial funding and international awareness, it also meant constantly reliving traumatic events and explaining complex emotional journeys to audiences seeking simple narratives about good versus evil. Maggie had initially resisted the spotlight, preferring to focus on practical conservation work rather than celebrity interviews. But she had come to understand that their story offered something unique, proof that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences when they chose love over fear, healing over harm. "The best part of tomorrow's interview," Maggie said, watching Django groom her cubs with the meticulous care that defined maternal love across all species, "will be showing people that this isn't really about us. It's about them, about what happens when you give life a chance to flourish instead of trying to exploit it for profit." Frank's phone buzzed with a text message from Samuel Kiprotich, their Maasai guide who had become the Conservation Center's cultural liaison and community outreach coordinator. The message brought news that made all three Americans smile. Another pregnant lioness had been spotted near the center's boundaries, exhibiting the same unusual behavior that had first brought Django to their attention. "Looks like word is spread in the lion community," Frank chuckled, showing them Samuel's message. "We might be getting another patient soon. Samuel says she's been hanging around the watering station for 3 days, showing signs of late pregnancy and apparent trust of human presence." The possibility of helping another lioness through difficult birth brought back memories of that storm-tossed night when everything had seemed impossible and rescue had come from the most unexpected directions. But now they had proper veterinary equipment, established protocols, and the confidence that came from successful experience. Mitchell's reaction to the news revealed how completely his priorities had transformed. Instead of seeing potential profit or exploitation opportunities, he immediately began planning security measures to protect another vulnerable family from the kind of criminals he had once led. "I'll coordinate with KWS Rangers to establish a protection perimeter," he said, his military planning skills now serving conservation rather than crime. "If she's seeking help like Django did, we need to ensure she feels safe throughout the process. No unauthorized personnel, no unnecessary stress." As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the African horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to celebrate the day's peaceful conclusion, Maggie reflected on the journey that had brought her from a grief-stricken widow in Ohio to a fulfilled conservation advocate in Kenya. The cubs began their evening play session, tumbling over each other with the exuberant joy that characterized healthy young predators learning essential survival skills through games. Their mother watched with the relaxed alertness of a parent who trusted her environment and the humans who had become part of her extended family. "You know what I realized today?" Maggie said, her voice soft with the contentment that came from finding purpose beyond personal loss. "I spent 47 years delivering human babies, always wondering if I was making a real difference in the world. Now I know that love doesn't have boundaries, species, nationality, age, or circumstance. When you choose to protect life, you become part of something bigger than yourself." Frank nodded with the wisdom of someone who had discovered that fixing broken things, whether machines, relationships, or wounded souls, was perhaps the most important work anyone could do. Mitchell remained quiet, his transformation still too recent and profound for easy articulation. But his presence among protectors rather than predators spoke volumes about the possibility of change. As darkness settled over the Masai Mara and the first stars appeared in the vast African sky, three unlikely friends prepared for another night of conservation work, their lives forever intertwined with the family of lions they had fought to save. The cubs' contented purring mixed with their mother's protective presence, creating a symphony of peace that echoed across the grasslands. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to protect vulnerable lives, and new chances to prove that healing was always possible for those who chose love over fear. But tonight, under the infinite African stars, all was well in a small corner of the world where humans and wildlife had learned to trust each other completely. The story that had begun with desperate medical intervention had become something far more beautiful, a testament to the transformative power of choosing to protect rather than exploit, to heal rather than harm, to love rather than fear the magnificent creatures who shared their world. Sometimes we reach our golden years feeling like our most important chapters are behind us, like the world no longer needs what we have to offer. But Maggie Thompson's story proves that our deepest wounds can become our greatest strengths, and our retirement years might just be when we discover our true calling. At 68, grieving her husband and estranged from her daughter, Maggie could have spent her remaining years in bitter isolation. Instead, she chose to risk everything for 3 newborn lion cubs in Kenya, using her decades of medical expertise to save lives that couldn't ask for help. Frank Williams, a 72-year-old mechanic haunted by his son's death in Iraq, found healing not in forgetting his pain, but in channeling it into protecting new life. Even Colonel Mitchell, consumed by 23 years of grief and rage, discovered that it's never too late to choose love over revenge. Their story reminds us that our scars don't disqualify us from making a difference. They prepare us for it. Every sleepless night we've endured, every loss we've survived, every skill we've mastered over decades of living has equipped us for purposes we haven't even imagined yet. Your next chapter isn't ending, it's waiting to begin. What loss in your life could become your greatest source of strength for helping others? Have you ever considered that your retirement might be preparation for your most important mission yet? Share your thoughts below. Your story might inspire someone else to discover their hidden calling.